Hi, my name is Evelyn, and my husband called me a burden as I lay in a hospital bed, half paralyzed, helpless. The next morning, he drained $1 million from my account and flew to Cancun with his mistress. Weeks later, I found forged documents. He planned to sell the only home I had left, behind my back. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I sold it first. I erased myself. And when he returned, grinning, his key wouldn't turn. He found a note taped to the door. It read, "A burden did this." But what made him laugh while I suffered? How far did he go before he lost everything? And what did I do, quietly, that destroyed him? Stick around. The truth is far messier than the lie. Before we dive in, what time are you listening to this and where from? Drop a comment below. You're not alone. I still remember the scent of rosemary that evening, how it clung to my fingers long after I'd chopped it. I stood in the kitchen, slow, deliberate, each motion taking effort. My left side had regained most of its strength, but the tremors came and went like unwanted guests overstaying their welcome. I stirred the pot carefully, my hand hovering just above the handle in case I lost grip. Cassian always said this stew reminded him of home. Tastes like real comfort, he'd told me the first time I made it. That was years ago, back when his eyes still softened when they looked at me, back when I believed a man's praise could be permanent. I held on to moments like that now, tender fragments in a life that had shifted beneath my feet. Outside, the golden spill of late spring light slipped through the blinds, landing across the wooden countertop like a quiet promise. The house was too quiet lately. No footsteps, no shared jokes from across rooms. Just me, a soft radio hum, and the sound of my breathing when it got heavy from effort. I ladled the stew into bowls, his portion always a little bigger, even now, and reached for the napkins, folding each one like I always did. Neat triangles, the way my mother taught me. She believed presentation mattered, even in private. "You never know who's watching," she'd said. That line had followed me into every corner of my marriage. Cassian and I had been married almost 20 years. I was the youngest daughter in a loud, proud family where girls learned to serve before they could speak. He met me when I was still soft, still eager to please, just out of nursing school. I'd just lost my father, and along with him, inherited more money than a girl like me knew what to do with. Cassian had plans. I had love. It seemed like a fair trade at the time. The truth is, my father's money built the first house we lived in, paid off Cassian's debts, carried us through lean years. He always said we were a team, but I was the quiet foundation he built his ambitions on. And lately, I'd started to feel the cracks. From the kitchen, I heard the click of his shoes in the hallway. His voice followed, low and quick. I assumed he was on a call. He took them all over the house now, never caring if I was in the next room. I didn't mean to listen. I didn't want to. But then his words cut through, clear, sharp, impossible to mishear. "She's just a burden now." Everything stopped. The ladle slipped from my hand and landed in the sink with a hollow clatter. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, misheard, misunderstood. But then I heard her laugh, light, flirtatious, cruel in its casualness. I'd never heard her voice before, but I knew exactly who she was. A mistress. My throat tightened. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't march into the hallway to demand answers. Instead, I reached for a towel, wiped my hands slowly, and set the bowls down at the table. One by one, as if nothing inside me had broken open. When he walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, he was smiling. "You made the stew," he said, pulling out a chair like it was any other evening. I smiled back. "It's been a while." He nodded, spooned a bite, and closed his eyes like it was some kind of blessing. "Tastes just like I remember." Then he launched into updates about work, meetings, travel plans, a possible promotion. I nodded in all the right places, laughed when he expected me to, asked follow-up questions with a steady voice. but every word he spoke felt like it scraped against raw skin. I heard none of it, only the echo of her laugh, and the word he used for me. Burden. When dinner was done, he stood and stretched like a man well-fed and well-loved. "I'll be in Chicago a few nights next week," he said. "Business stuff, nothing big." He reached into his pocket and tossed his keys onto the counter. That gesture, so casual, sent something cold down my spine. The way his keys clinked and slid, like they belonged to him, like everything here did. I looked at them for a beat too long, not knowing why, just feeling something shift in me. A small click. A seed. Later that night, I sat in bed while he snored beside me. The digital clock glowed 2:11 a.m. I hadn't blinked in over an hour. She's just a burden now. The words looped in my mind over and over, like a cruel lullaby. I repeated them softly, testing their weight in my own mouth. Each time they tasted bitter, rotten. Then, without really thinking, I whispered something I hadn't meant to say aloud. If I am a burden, then one day he'll learn what a burden can do. And somehow, I knew I meant it. And when I found the bank records the next morning, the true scale of his betrayal started to unfold. The light creeping through the blinds caught the steam from my coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, still in my robe, hands wrapped around the warm mug like it might anchor me. The house was still, quiet in that eerie way after someone leaves in a hurry. Cassian had rushed out half an hour earlier, murmuring something about a last-minute meeting. His tie had been crooked, and his smile a little too sweet. I watched him scroll on his phone before he left. The way his mouth curled up, not like he was reading a work email. No, this was different. Softer. Familiar. Intimate. He didn't kiss me goodbye. As the front door shut behind him, I stared at the empty hallway. Something in my chest pressed down like a weight I couldn't name. I hadn't touched our accounts in months. I'd been too focused on recovery, trusting, no, assuming everything was being handled. I opened the laptop with trembling fingers, entered the passwords, waited for the numbers to load, and then I saw it. Hundreds of thousands. Gone. Not just one large withdrawal, a slow bleed, weeks, maybe months, travel bookings, luxury purchases, a wire transfer flagged to a name I didn't recognize, female, but I didn't need confirmation, jewelry, flights, hotels I'd never stayed in. It was all there, neat as a receipt. I didn't breathe. I stared at the numbers, blinking, hoping it was some glitch, a miscalculation, but it wasn't. I knew it the same way I knew a wound by the way it aches before you see blood. My inheritance. Nearly $1 million. Drained. Used to fund another woman's life. My hand hovered above the keyboard. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pick up the phone and call my sister, blast it all into the air like fireworks. But I could already hear their voices. You're overreacting. Maybe it's a business partner. Just talk to him. I was always the youngest. The soft one, the one they patted on the head and talked over. I printed the statements, slid them into a plain folder, tucked it under a stack of old magazines. My fingers were still shaking, but I moved slowly, like I was handling something that could shatter if I breathed too hard. I walked to the sink, poured out the now cold coffee. The window above it overlooked the backyard. Cassian had promised to build a garden out there one summer. He never did. The mail slot clacked. I startled. My body was on edge, every sound too loud. I walked to the door, opened it, and bent down for the pile. One envelope caught my eye. It was addressed to Cassian. The return address was a law office downtown. I stared at it. A voice inside me said, "Don't." But my fingers were already tearing the seal. It was a legal draft. A power of attorney. It looked official, stamped, notarized, but the signature at the bottom, it was mine. or more accurately, a version of mine, slanted just enough to pass, but I knew how my hand curved on the Y, how I looped my S. This wasn't my handwriting. This was forged, sloppy, desperate, but good enough for someone who thought I'd never look. My eyes moved to the section listing the property, the house. This house. The only thing still in my name. The one thing I kept when everything else became ours. The air in the room shifted, thicker. I sat down slowly on the couch, paper in hand, knees trembling. He was going to sell the house. My house. Without a word, without permission, with a lie. I leaned back against the cushions, eyes scanning the ceiling like it might give me an answer. Something old in me stirred. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter, older. A part of me I'd let sleep too long. I walked upstairs to the bedroom, opened the top drawer of my nightstand, pulled out an old photo, me and my father, standing in front of this very house the week we signed the deed. He had one arm around me, the other holding up a ring of shiny new keys. His smile wide, mine nervous. "This home will always be your anchor," he'd said. I held that photo tight against my chest. Closed my eyes. I could almost feel his hand on my shoulder again. It was the only thing keeping me from unraveling. I didn't cry. I just sat there, holding that photograph, letting it stitch me back together in silence. Later that afternoon, I returned the envelope to the stack of mail like I'd never touched it. I placed the folder with the bank records under my pillow. I moved slower, but with a strange sense of clarity. The kind that comes after everything breaks. When the sun dipped below the trees, I stood at the kitchen counter again. Same place as last night. Same silence. Cassian's keys were still on the hook. His mug sat in the sink, lipstick on the rim. I touched the folder once more before heading upstairs. And just before I turned off the light, I whispered out loud, steady and clear, "If they want my house, they'll have to bleed for it." I picked up the phone. Found the number for Daniel Hayes, an old friend of my father's, a retired attorney who still owed me a favor. My finger hovered over the call button. Then I stopped. Not yet. Let them think I'm still asleep. But the moment I held that paper in my hands, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't a scream or a fire or anything loud. It was quieter than that, like a cold current running beneath the skin. A hum in my bones. I sat still on the edge of the couch, holding the forged document like it might crumble if I moved too quickly. Outside, the sky had gone dim, the kind of gray that warned of a storm without actually delivering one. Just a hush, a pause, a weight in the air that matched the one sitting in my chest. The house creaked with its usual evening sounds, settling wood, the fridge humming, wind tapping gently at the back window, and me, sitting alone in the middle of it all, surrounded by papers that spelled out betrayal in bold ink. I looked down at the folder in my lap. Printouts of our bank accounts, the document with my forged signature, the letterhead of a law office that had no idea it was helping a man steal from his wife. The word burden rang in my ears again, cruel and sharp, no matter how many times I tried to push it aside. I thought about the days I could barely lift a spoon without help, when my body had failed me after the stroke. Cassian hadn't been cruel to my face, but he'd been absent in all the ways that mattered. The late-night calls he took in the hallway, the slight wince when I asked for help up the stairs, the impatient sigh when I needed time to answer a question. I used to chalk it up to stress, or fear, or discomfort. But looking at these papers now, I saw it for what it was. Distance, detachment, contempt. I leaned back and closed my eyes, and in the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw my father. It was a spring afternoon, maybe 3 years ago. We were sitting at the dining table, and I had just gotten frustrated while writing a grocery list. My hand shook too much to hold the pen steady. "Try it this way," he'd said, gently repositioning my fingers. "A new signature, just for you. No one else needs to see it, but if your hand won't do what it used to, then we teach it a new rhythm." And I did. I practiced it, over and over. The loops were different. My name looked unfamiliar at first, but it became mine again. Now, looking at the document Cassian had forged, I saw the difference. He'd used the old signature, the one I hadn't used since before the stroke. He didn't just guess. He knew. He chose to use that version. It was easier to fake. And in that moment, it hit me. Not just that he didn't love me anymore, but that he never thought I'd notice. He counted on me being too broken, too quiet, too tired to fight. He didn't underestimate me. He erased me. The grief wasn't soft anymore. It wasn't the kind you cry over into a pillow. It was raw, tight, like standing on your porch watching someone load your life into a truck, waving like they'd earned it. I stood up and walked slowly to the bedroom. My legs weren't as strong as they used to be, but they carried me forward with something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. I slid open the bottom drawer of my dresser and pulled out a small wooden lockbox. I hadn't touched it since before the stroke. It still smelled like cedar inside. I placed the forged power of attorney inside, then added the bank statements. I locked it shut with the tiny brass key and slid it under the bed. That small click. It wasn't just a sound. It was a decision. I sat on the bed for a long moment before reaching for a leather-bound journal I kept tucked behind old books on the shelf. It was one of those things you always mean to fill but never do. I turned to the first blank page. I began writing dates, transactions, flight numbers, jewelry purchases, the names of banks. Notes about Cassian's recent behavior, how often he mentioned business trips, and the way he never left his phone unattended anymore. I didn't know exactly what I was building, but it felt important, like laying bricks for something solid. But then, I paused. The pen hovered midair, and for a heartbeat, I thought about stopping. What was the point? The house suddenly felt enormous, cold, like every picture on the wall was watching me, judging me for not being enough. I thought about packing a bag, about walking out and letting it all go. Maybe he won. Maybe I was a burden. Maybe it was just easier to disappear. But then I heard it. Laughter. Not from inside, but outside. Children playing in the cul-de-sac. The kind of high, full-belly giggle that only kids can produce. It came in through the screen like music, like memory. I stood up and peeked through the blinds. 2 little girls were skipping rope while their mother watched from a lawn chair, sipping something warm. One of them tripped, and the other held her hand, pulled her back up. They were mimicking someone. I could tell. And suddenly I thought, if I don't stand up, if I don't say something, I teach silence. I show the next woman, the next girl, that being stepped on is just part of the dance. I turned back to the journal, closed it with purpose. "He thinks I'm paralyzed in more ways than one," I said aloud. Then I smiled. He's wrong. The next morning, I watched him pack for Rome, his laughter filling the house like I was already gone. He moved through the bedroom with a strange kind of joy, whistling, folding shirts, checking his itinerary on the phone. From the way he talked about the conference, you'd think it was a reward he'd earned through hard work and sacrifice. But I knew better now. I knew every hotel, every dinner, every sleek rental car had been paid for with the money my father had left me. The money I'd once imagined using for our retirement, or maybe for the grandkids we never had. He was wearing the same cologne he wore on our first anniversary, something I hadn't smelled in years. It wasn't for me. It was a message. He sprayed it in front of the mirror, gave himself a satisfied look, then turned to me as if expecting approval. "Shouldn't be more than 10 days, he said, placing his watch in a velvet pouch. The hotel has a rooftop bar. Maybe I'll FaceTime you so you can see the view. I nodded, murmuring something about bringing back an espresso cup for our collection. My voice sounded normal, maybe even cheerful. I don't know how I managed it. Under the table, my hands trembled so badly that I had to grip the edge of the seat to keep from spilling the juice I'd poured him. He finished his coffee in 2 quick gulps, tossed the napkin aside, then walked around the table and kissed my forehead. Not a kiss of love, not even one of guilt. It felt institutional, like a nurse patting the head of a long-term patient. Something automatic, distant. "Don't wait up," he said, grinning. "You've got the house all to yourself." I forced a smile, lips tight, and waved as he left. The front door clicked shut, then opened again seconds later. He'd forgotten his laptop. He laughed, tossed a quick, "What would I do without you?" over his shoulder, and disappeared once more. Through the living room window, I watched his car back out of the driveway. He didn't look back, not once. I thought I was alone until I saw Carol, our neighbor across the street, standing by her mailbox. She spotted me through the glass. Our eyes met. She didn't wave. She just gave a tight nod, as if offering condolences for something no one had spoken aloud. I'd known her for 20 years. She'd brought casseroles when my mother passed, helped shovel snow when Cassian had meetings. Now, she couldn't even meet my eyes for more than a second. That told me everything. He'd gotten to them first, told them something, maybe that I was ill again, confused, not myself, a fragile wife, a woman in decline. I let the curtain fall and sat down on the couch. The silence was thick, not peaceful, just still. I stared at the stack of papers I'd hidden the night before. For a moment, I wanted to tear them up, burn them, pretend I could forget what I'd seen. Instead, I walked to the bedroom, unlocked the box under the bed, and laid the forged power of attorney on my lap. I traced my finger across the signature, my old signature, the one I stopped using after the tremors, the one Cassian knew I couldn't replicate now. "If silence is all I have left," I whispered, "then silence will be my weapon." It wasn't a vow made in anger. It wasn't even loud, but it was sharp, focused. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't confront. I'd act in silence, behind the scenes, in shadows where he thought I was too weak to crawl. I walked through the house slowly, barefoot. I touched the doorway my father had measured my height on as a girl, ran my hand along the banister we'd sanded together, opened cabinets he'd built with his own 2 hands. Every corner of this house carried his print, and now Cassian wanted to sign it away with a lie. This wasn't just a building. It was a battleground. In the hallway closet, behind a box of Christmas lights, I found the journal. I opened it to the 2nd page and wrote one line. "When he comes back, this house will no longer be his." I closed the cover, slid it back behind the lights. I didn't know how yet, but I would find a way. And when he returned from Rome, smiling, relaxed, maybe carrying a gift from a duty-free shop, he'd walk into a home that no longer belonged to him. The line crackled faintly before I heard his voice. Calm, measured, with a hint of surprise laced in warmth. "Well, I thought you'd forgotten me." "Never," I said, though my throat felt tight. "I just didn't know if I had the right to call." Fermin hadn't changed. His words still had that deliberate rhythm, like a man who'd argued in too many courtrooms to ever rush a sentence. He was the only one left who had known both me and my father, not as a client and her lawyer, but as people, real people. I told him everything in pieces, about the forged signature, the money siphoned from our account, the woman Cassian was likely spending it on, and most of all, the quiet unraveling of the life I thought I'd built. There were long pauses while he listened. At one point, I thought he might be writing something down. Then came his answer, firm and clear. "You still own the house outright. He can forge all the papers he wants, but unless you sign it willingly, It stays yours. That one sentence loosened something in my chest. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath the whole time. It's your battlefield now, Fermin added, his tone darkening. And if he's smart, he won't underestimate you. We spoke for another few minutes, discussing legal steps I could take discreetly. Nothing formal yet, just strategy. When I hung up, the room was pitch black, save for the soft amber glow of the kitchen nightlight. I sat in that stillness for a long time. The idea of fighting felt massive, too big for a woman like me, half paralyzed, hidden behind lace curtains in a neighborhood that had already written her off. A part of me whispered, what if you just stayed, let it play out? Eventually he'll get bored. He always does. But then I heard it again. That word, burden. That word had no exit door. It was meant to trap me in it. I stood slowly, walked into the bedroom, and opened the journal I'd tucked behind the holiday lights. My hand no longer shook as I wrote the title at the top of the next page. Plan. Phase 1. Step 1. Contact realtors who value privacy. Step 2. Research short-term storage under a different name. Step 3. Start sorting. Mine. His. Ours. I looked around the room, lit now only by the blue-white light of the moon through the blinds. His side of the closet was full of tailored suits, monogrammed cufflinks, leather belts coiled like snakes. None of it would leave this house with me. I wouldn't take the weight of his life into the next chapter of mine. That night, I filled 2 boxes, things that were purely mine. Books my mother gave me. Old photographs of my childhood, a quilt I'd sewn during chemo treatments that Cassian never acknowledged. I lined them neatly and labeled each with a single dot on the corner, my code. Later, as I sat with a cup of chamomile, my phone buzzed with a voicemail. I didn't recognize the number. I nearly deleted it without listening, but something made me tap play. It was Gale, my stepson. His voice still had that half-boy tone, a young man trying too hard to sound sure of himself. Hey, Dad said you might be going away for a while. Is that true? Are you okay, Grandma? I didn't realize I was crying until I heard the tea spill over onto the saucer in my lap. Gale. He was the only one who'd ever asked if I was okay without adding a condition, without making it about someone else. He didn't call me Mom, never had, but Grandma stuck after he had his first child, and somehow it had felt more intimate than anything else. For a few seconds, my resolve cracked. Maybe I was running. Maybe I was doing what Cassian accused me of, making everything about me. Maybe if I stayed, things would settle. Calm down. Maybe I could talk to him. Show him how far he'd gone. Then I remembered watching Gale once mimic the way Cassian slammed the door after a fight. Just a boy then, laughing as he acted it out. They learn by watching. If I stayed, I wasn't just surrendering. I was giving Gale a front-row seat to what defeat looks like, what silence teaches. I wiped my eyes and stood. The quilt still lay folded in the box. I picked it up, held it close, then laid it gently on the couch instead. Let the house keep one memory. I returned to my journal, wrote below the plan. Better he learns from my silence than from my surrender. By midnight, I had every box labeled, every call prepared. I sat at the dining room table, the same one where Cassian had once carved his initials like a teenage boy showing off. I stared at that faint groove for a long time, then opened the journal once more and circled the first step I'd written earlier. Sell the house before he returns. I said it out loud, just once. This home will bury him, not me. And with that, I turned off the light, walked to bed, and for the first time in weeks, slept through the night. By Monday morning, I had an appointment with a realtor who promised discretion and speed. The drive into downtown Cleveland was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones. I kept the windows halfway down, letting the breeze bite at my cheeks as if I needed to stay sharp, fully awake for what was coming. Evelyn was already at the corner table in the coffee shop where we agreed to meet. Not in a crisp suit like I'd expected, but in jeans and a soft blue cardigan. She looked like someone's aunt, or maybe a teacher on summer break, exactly the kind of person no one would suspect of selling a house behind a husband's back. "I did some checking," she said gently as she handed me her card. "You're still the sole name on the deed. We'll move fast. He won't see this coming." There was no sympathy in her tone, and I appreciated that more than I could say. Pity makes people hesitate. Evelyn didn't hesitate once. Back home, the sun was already shifting west, pouring light through the blinds in long, golden streaks. I didn't bother with music or distractions, just silence and the sound of boxes being folded, tape stretching and snapping. I labeled each one carefully: M for mine, C for Cassian's, and a red dot for shared things I hadn't decided on yet. Each item I touched brought its own whisper. The wine glasses from our trip to Napa, one cracked, but I kept it anyway. A scarf he brought back from Milan, which I later learned was actually from Celine. The throw pillow from my mother's old couch that Cassian always complained was too scratchy. It felt like packing for a move and a funeral at once. Mid-afternoon, I loaded a few boxes into the trunk and drove them to a storage facility 2 towns over, under the name Clara Monroe, an alias I hadn't used in years. The woman at the front desk didn't ask questions. She just handed me a lock and pointed down the hallway. Back at the house, the weight of what I was doing hadn't fully sunk in, until the doorbell rang. It was her, Celine, dressed in white, like she'd just walked out of a catalog. She held a bouquet of cheap flowers and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "For the patient," she said, brushing past me like she belonged there. My heart stuttered. I offered tea, out of habit, or maybe defiance, and led her into the kitchen, where she looked around like she was taking inventory. "I've always thought this place had potential," she said, her gaze lingering on the cabinets. "Cassian says you've been overwhelmed lately. Poor thing. Maybe I'll redesign this kitchen when it's mine." She said it like she was commenting on the weather. I didn't respond. Not with words. I just poured her tea, set it gently on the table, and smiled. Inside, my hands were clenched so tightly my nails dug crescents into my palms. But I didn't let it show. Not yet. Celine didn't stay long. She didn't need to. Her presence was her message. And once she was gone, the house felt colder, like she'd taken something with her. I dropped to the floor in the hallway, my back against the wall, and just shook. Not from fear, from fury. My body isn't what it used to be. Too many battles behind me, not enough energy ahead. But rage has a way of hollowing you out and filling you with something else. Something dangerous. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stared at the ceiling fan spinning above me, counting each slow rotation until my breath came back. Eventually, I crawled to the kitchen, pulled myself up by the edge of the counter, and there they were. Cassian's keys. Still on the hook. Untouched. He hadn't even noticed I hadn't packed them in his luggage. That small detail was enough to pull me back together. I grabbed my journal from the drawer beside the fridge. The pages were already filling with lists, reminders, timelines. I turned to the last entry and wrote slowly, carefully, "Control is an illusion, and I'm taking it back." That night, the air changed. Clouds rolled in before dinner, thick and heavy, pressing low over the neighborhood. The kind of storm that doesn't just rattle windows, but shakes something loose inside you. I turned off every light, opened the front windows just a crack, and sat in the living room, facing the street. I could feel it building, the wind, the electricity, the reckoning. I watched the street lamps flicker, shadows shifting on the pavement, and in that stillness, I whispered, "This storm will wash his empire away." And I meant it. The storm hadn't passed by morning, but neither had my resolve. I was ready to strike first. I didn't bother with makeup. My hair was pulled back, my coat was soaked halfway through by the time I made it into Evelyn's office. She greeted me with a quiet nod, no questions asked, just action. We sat across from each other at a modest desk tucked behind a row of filing cabinets. The lamp between us flickered slightly from the residual static in the air. Evelyn handed me a pen and slid the final sale documents toward me. My fingers trembled as I reached for them, not from weakness, but from the weight of what it meant. Everything Cassian thought he controlled, everything he stole behind my back, now sat in front of me, waiting for my signature to slip through his grasp. Evelyn's voice was calm. "Once you sign, there's no reversing this. He can't touch the house after today." I nodded. The sound of ink dragging across paper was quieter than I expected, but it roared inside me. It was the sound of reclaiming my life, piece by piece. By mid-morning, I took a cab to the courthouse. I kept my coat on in the lobby. The air smelled like wet paper and tired linoleum. A clerk behind thick glass handed me a number, but I didn't sit down. I stood near the back wall, glancing around, trying to steady my breath. While waiting to file an injunction to freeze any claims Cassian's forged documents might have initiated, I overheard two men chatting just outside the records office. "Cassian's got this in the bag," one of them chuckled, flipping through a file. "Couple signatures and the house is his clean. The wife's practically a ghost." My jaw tightened. My legs almost carried me toward them, ready to unleash every ounce of fury I'd bottled up, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped forward, handed my papers to the clerk, and said, "I'd like these sealed and expedited, today." He nodded, took the envelope, and stamped it with a firm thud. Just like that, Cassian's moves were paralyzed. As I stepped outside, the sky was still an angry gray. Wind tugged at my scarf. I headed toward the curb to call a cab, but paused when I saw her, Celine, leaning against a black sedan like she was in a perfume commercial. She spotted me instantly and didn't bother hiding her smirk. "Cassian said you'd put up a fight," she said, arms crossed like this was a game she was already winning. I didn't blink. "He underestimates me," I replied, my voice as calm as I could manage. "You all do." Then I turned and walked away, refusing to let her see even a hint of hesitation. My heels clicked sharply on the concrete, each step louder than her silence. By early afternoon, I was back at the house. Evelyn had arranged a moving crew, cash paid, no paper trail. They didn't ask questions. They just carried boxes out, one by one. I stood in the doorway, watching pieces of my life disappear into the truck, not with sorrow, but with clarity. The bedroom was hardest. I lingered over drawers of old photographs, letters I'd almost forgotten I kept. I didn't cry. I just folded them neatly into a box labeled with my alias, then closed the lid. What once held memories now felt like evidence, and I wasn't about to leave any behind. By evening, the house was nearly empty. Only the bare furniture remained, the shell of a life carefully staged, but hollow. I walked into the living room and set one thing on the mantel: our wedding portrait. We'd taken it in Italy, during a time I now realized was already filled with cracks. I uncapped a red marker, dragged a bold slash across his face, and stepped back. It wasn't about vandalism. It was about warning. This home, the walls we once built together, would not welcome him again. Outside, thunder cracked again, louder now, more insistent. The wind howled through the trees out front. The movers gave me a final nod before climbing into the truck. I stood alone in the doorway, gripping the frame for a moment, then stepped back inside and looked around one last time. The walls echoed. 1,000 arguments. Laughter. Lies. All of it still lingering, but none of it powerful anymore. "This house belongs to no one now," I whispered. Then I locked the door. I took the keys, slipped them into my pocket, and without looking back, walked into the storm. Behind me, thunder rolled again, louder, like the sky itself was closing a chapter. By nightfall, the house was no longer a home. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. The last of the storm clouds had rolled east, leaving behind the kind of eerie calm that never quite feels clean. Wet pavement gleamed under the streetlights. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Then the low hum of a luxury engine broke through. Cassian's silver sedan pulled into the driveway like nothing had changed. The car door opened, and he stepped out, humming softly to himself, clearly pleased. His jacket was freshly pressed, collar popped just enough to remind the world he still thought he was the smartest man on the block. Celine remained in the passenger seat, checking her lipstick in the visor mirror, acting like she already owned the place. Cassian grabbed his suitcase from the back seat, hoisted it by the handle, and made his way up the front steps with a spring in his step. He didn't even glance around. Of course he didn't. In his mind, the world still revolved around his plans. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the brass house key, his house key, and slid it into the lock. It stopped halfway in. He twisted it anyway, expecting cooperation. Nothing. He pulled it out, checked it, frowned like the lock was the one making a mistake. Again, he shoved it in. Still nothing. The smug curve of his mouth began to flatten. A subtle shift at first, but I imagined it clearly, like I was standing right behind him. The certainty in his shoulders faltered. He glanced behind him at Celine, but she hadn't noticed yet, too busy lighting a cigarette, exhaling with the confidence of someone who thought she had the winning hand. He tried the key a third time, this time with both hands. Still didn't budge. He leaned in and knocked, first politely, then louder. "Elaine?" he called. "It's me. Open up." Silence. He knocked again, now sharper. "Elaine." His voice bounced off the empty porch and spilled into the quiet street. A light flickered on across the road. Curtains shifted. One by one, the neighbors peeked out from behind blinds and windows. Not enough to interfere, just enough to witness. Cassian banged harder now, his voice rising. "Open the damn door!" But no one answered. And that's when he noticed it. Taped just below the brass knocker, a cream envelope, sealed, his name written in ink. He ripped it from the tape, tore it open. Inside, just one line written in my careful hand. "A burden did this." He stood frozen. His eyes scanned the words once, then again, as if the meaning would shift with repetition. But it didn't. Behind him, Celine stepped out of the car, heels clicking against the wet concrete. "What's going on?" she asked, the cigarette still in her hand, half burned and forgotten. He turned around, holding the note like it had burned him. "What does it mean?" she asked again, more hesitant this time. But Cassian couldn't form an answer. He looked around. One neighbor shut their blinds too late. Another ducked back behind a curtain, but not before he caught their eye. The same people who had once waved at him, called him by name, invited him to cookouts. They were watching now, and not with admiration, with curiosity, pity, maybe even satisfaction. The man who controlled everything couldn't even open his own front door. His breath came heavier. The weight of the moment began to crush the image he had so carefully crafted. He tugged at the doorknob with both hands now, pounded his fist against the frame. "Elaine, open this damn door right now." Celine took a step back, arms crossed. "Cassian, did she sell the house?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. At the far end of the street, a moving truck rounded the corner. Its cargo doors closed tight, engine humming, driving slowly toward the neighborhood exit. Inside, though he wouldn't know it yet, were the last traces of my life in that house. The photos, the books, my father's tools, everything that mattered, and nothing that belonged to him. He watched it pass, his face a mask of disbelief and rising fury. Everything he'd built, on lies, manipulation, forged papers, had vanished in a single, quiet stroke. Celine said something else. I couldn't hear it from where I was, but her tone shifted. She was no longer amused. The front door, once a gateway to his pride and power, stood cold and silent. He turned back toward it and slammed his fist one last time, the sound echoing down the block like a cracked bell. But no one came. No wife. No suitcase inside. No legacy waiting. Only bare walls and silence. Behind that door there was nothing left for him. As his rage echoed through the night, I was already far away, watching the skyline of a new city rise before me. I'd driven through most of the night, headlights carving a narrow tunnel of clarity through the darkness. Now, hours later, I stood on the balcony of a modest apartment, my new apartment. The boxes inside were still taped shut, my name scribbled on their sides in my own handwriting. It didn't feel like home yet, but it didn't have to. It felt like mine. The skyline blinked steadily in the distance, unfamiliar and full of possibility. There were no shared memories etched into the bricks, no ghosts in the floorboards, just new air, new silence. Not the heavy kind I used to sit through, where a slammed door or a withheld glance could choke a room, but true silence. Peaceful. Unjudging. Still. I left the sliding door open behind me and stepped back inside, curling up on the small couch with a blanket that still smelled like laundry soap. My body ached, not from the drive, but from years of bracing myself. It was a soreness that went deeper than muscle. One box sat on the coffee table, already opened. Inside wasn't much, just my journal. I pulled it into my lap and flipped it open. Its pages were dog-eared and creased, filled with careful notes, scribbled dates, phone numbers I'd memorized, then burned, and words I'd written through tears I couldn't let anyone see. This journal had been my lifeline, my lighthouse. I ran my fingers across the ink as if touching the past could finally make peace with it. Every word I had written reminded me of who I'd had to become, not just to survive, but to outthink, outmaneuver, and escape. What started as a record of desperation had turned into a blueprint for freedom. One word kept showing up on the pages, circled again and again, some passages so deep it had nearly torn the paper. Burden. That word had once flattened me. The way he'd said it, offhand, as if I were a misplaced suitcase or a tired dog, had carved itself into my spine. But tonight, that word sat differently. Tonight, it was armor. A burden, after all, could bring down a house. A burden could move mountains. A burden could outlast a man like him. I closed the journal and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling, letting the quiet wash over me again. No voices, no tension, just breath. Later that week, the whispers began trickling in. Cassian's forged paperwork had reached the wrong desk at the courthouse. Fermin's sealed injunction had hit like a quiet grenade. Investigations were underway. His name, once spoken like it carried weight, was now followed by sighs and raised eyebrows. I didn't seek out the details, but they found me anyway. One neighbor wrote to say he'd seen Celine pack up her things and leave. Another mentioned how Cassian had started walking his dog alone, looking hollow. The man who used to bark orders now sat in silence, drowning in the echo of what he'd lost. And yet, I didn't gloat, I didn't post, I didn't brag, I didn't chase every legal thread that could have buried him deeper, because I was done living inside his shadow. That, I decided, was real power. Some people think revenge is fire and fury, but I learned, sometimes it's walking away without looking back. That lesson came in handy when I met Erin, the young woman who lived across the hall from me. She knocked on my door one night, asking to borrow a wrench. Her eye was red, her voice small. She mentioned her boyfriend in passing, said he didn't think she needed to fix things on her own. I handed her the wrench, then paused. "Don't wait as long as I did," I said softly. She looked at me like I'd said too much, or maybe like she understood everything I didn't say out loud. After she left, I stood by the window, watching the lights twinkle like stars drawn by someone who had finally remembered how to dream. My body still trembled sometimes, especially when I least expected it, like when closing cabinet doors too loudly or hearing certain songs on the radio. But my spirit, that didn't shake anymore. I whispered into the room, not to anyone, not even to myself, but to the air. Freedom was never given to me. I had to take it. And I had. I walked to the dresser, slid the journal into the bottom drawer, and closed it with finality. Not to forget, but to rest. Tomorrow wouldn't be easy. Life never promised ease. But tomorrow would be mine.